everybody, and welcome to another Florida-friendly landscaping educational program. Today, we're going to follow up with a program we had about what could go wrong, and we were talking mostly about landscape plants at that time. And it occurred to Dr. Lester and I that people will also want to know specifically what could go wrong with growing fruits and vegetables. And since Dr. Lester is the area expert on edible crops for the homeowners, I would like to introduce Dr. Bill Lester. He's our urban horticulture agent at Hernando County Extension. And let's just get started. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lily. And yes, I do get a lot of practice answering questions on what could possibly go wrong with growing my fruits and vegetables. And this is a very good introduction to a pair of classes that we have scheduled coming up in the near future, titled Diagnosing Plant Problems, Part 1 and Part 2. So that is going to go into much more in-depth about what kind of problems plants can have and how to go about diagnosing them, so you're not just kind of taking a shot in the dark or going out to your shed and grabbing something and spraying indiscriminately, hoping that you're going to solve the problem when in reality you haven't even identified the problem. So the best way to find out about these upcoming classes and all of our upcoming classes is if you go to www.hernandoextension.com. Hernando Extension's all one word. That's a complete listing of all of our upcoming classes, when they're going to be, whether there's registration or not, if they're going to be here on Zoom or on Facebook Live or YouTube Live. We have classes all the time on a wide variety of topics. But today's little presentation is just going to be kind of an overview, preparing people for being able to learn how to diagnose their own plant problems and hopefully come to a conclusion what the proper cure is going to be. So when you start to think about what could possibly go wrong with growing any kind of fruits and vegetables on your property here in Hernando County, and this is primarily for Central Florida or Hernando County, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. These are some pictures of a citrus tree that were sent to me, and there's at least a dozen things wrong with this poor orange tree. And I think the person that sent this to me asked, there's something wrong with my tree, what's wrong and what can I do to fix it? Unfortunately, at this point, it's probably gone too far for you to be able to fix it. This tree is probably not going to survive because one problem has led to two problems and three problems and four problems. It's so much easier and more effective to properly diagnose what's wrong early and take steps to fix it early instead of waiting until it's just gotten completely out of control like this. So as a general rule, if you're looking at what could go wrong with your edible plantings, there's three major areas. One of them would be insects, and then all the other different things that could eat or damage your plants. And there are a number of them out there. There's a number of different suspects that may have caused that plant damage in the middle of the night last night or yesterday. Another large area is diseases, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about. They assume it's an insect problem because everybody is familiar with insects, but not so much plant diseases. And then probably the biggest problem area that we have to deal with and answer questions on and advise people on would fall under poor planning, or basically you being the problem. And I don't want to pick on anybody in particular. We all make mistakes when it comes to gardening outdoors. We all kind of fall behind, but a lot of times people's problems are a direct result of either poor planning or poor expectations or not following the one major Florida-friendly landscape rule, the right plant in the right place. So it kind of falls down to poor planning. So some possible plant damagers out in your yard, obviously insects. Here in Central Florida, we do have a variety of insects, and pretty much any kind of fruiting or edible plant that you're going to try to grow in your yard is fed on by some kind of insect, and many times a number of different kinds of insects. We also have nematodes in the soil. Nematodes are microscopic little roundworms, many of which are beneficial. They eat bacteria in the soil, they eat fungi, they help to recycle and break down organic matter and recycle the nutrients. Very, very important part of the ecosystem. But some species of nematodes damage plants by feeding on the roots. So that's something else out there that could physically damage your plants. For people who live a little bit further out in the country, you have a whole host of different animals that could be damaging your plants. Deer, squirrels, like we have picture here, birds, if you grow any kind of plant that produces a fruit, whether that's blueberries, strawberries, tomatoes, wide variety of things, birds are going to come along and eat the fruit, especially early in the season. Deer are surprisingly not picky about what they eat. They'll eat darn near anything. And I know that they will defoliate citrus trees up to about chest high. So I visited a small orchard just outside of Brooksville once before, and a lot of their citrus trees were about 15, 20 feet tall, and all the leaves from about chest high down were missing because the deer came by in the middle of the night and ate every leaf that they could possibly reach. So that's something that could go wrong with your plants. If you look outside one morning and you see your plant has been damaged and there's leaves that are missing or torn or ripped up or chewed on, where do you start trying to figure out what the problem could be? Well, first of all, like I mentioned, there are a lot of different insects here that do feed on all different edible plants. Chewing insects are pretty easy to identify from the damage they do. That would be caterpillars, beetles, grasshoppers. They all have chewing mouths. And if you remember from grade school, the hungry, hungry caterpillar will come along and chew up a leaf, and now either half the leaf is gone, all of it is gone. That's pretty easy to identify. We do have other insects, and they damage plants by piercing into them or poking into them and sucking the juices out. And sometimes they'll spread diseases that way also. So if you look very carefully in this picture of a small citrus fruit, you'll see little things sitting on top of that fruit. Those are Asian citrus psyllids, and they're very small insects, and they're very damaging to citrus because they are the insect that spreads a really bad disease called citrus greening that if your tree gets it, it will most likely die from. So many insects are not really easy to spot or highly visible because they're very small. So you need to be observant, be diligent, go out there, look through your entire plant, turn over leaves, look at stems, get yourself a magnifying glass or a hand lens because many of them are very small. You're going to have to use a magnifying glass to get an up close look. And that's going to help you identify insects if your problem is insects. Don't listen too much to some of the advice and information you may see on social media, especially certain Facebook groups. Sometimes it seems like every question that's posted on there, the answer from everybody is just spray it with neem. Neem oil can be an effective insecticide under certain circumstances, but it does not solve all the problems in the world. And if your problem is an animal or disease or something else, neem oil will not fix your problem. And then don't just assume that if your plants don't look right, they must have an insect problem, because unfortunately, I talk with a lot of people who think that, and then they make a beeline to their shed, they grab whatever insecticide they happen to have there and spray it in the hopes that my problem must have been an insect. If I spray it with this insecticide, it's going to fix it. And many times that just results in dead plants because they didn't read the label. The spray that they used was not appropriate for what they sprayed it on. It did not solve the problem because their initial problem wasn't even an insect to begin with. So don't do that. Start at the beginning and figure out what your problem is first, and then you can start to take steps to figure out how to cure it. Sometimes it's easy though. Sometimes, a lot of times I get pictures emailed to me like this. These are flea hoppers on a plant, and it's very, very easy to see what they are and that you obviously have an insect problem. They are piercing, sucking insects, so they're going to poke holes in these leaves and damage the plant that way. And I know exactly what this is and exactly what to recommend to help control it. But a lot of other insect and mysterious animal problems aren't nearly as easy to diagnose. When it comes to animals eating your plants, you may have to go out there at night with a flashlight and try to catch them in the act. People will set up trail cameras, or now with ring cameras for the outside of your house, you can actually hook something up to get to the bottom of who is coming by in the middle of the night and damaging my plants. And then you can put up an appropriate fence or deterrent or take steps to help prevent it that way. So plant diseases. Here in Florida, we do have a lot of plant diseases because we have the perfect environment for it. And plant diseases could be a fungus. We do have a lot of fungal plant diseases here. It could be a bacteria, or it could be a virus. So fungal diseases are by far the most common here in Central Florida. And even though people who garden up north and have moved here have fungal diseases up north in the summer also, they're usually not as numerous, and they don't have quite the variety of different fungi that we have down here. So this picture here is a pumpkin plant, and it's starting to get the very first symptoms of powdery mildew, which if you ever try growing pumpkins or cucumbers or any kind of squash, you'll probably get this disease. And it's very important that you treat it appropriately. Otherwise, those little white spots are going to spread, they're going to turn brown, and they're very quickly going to kill your plant. So plant diseases, like I said, didn't want to get too deeply into them in this presentation. They are a huge problem here, and you need to understand some basics about plant diseases and how to go about identifying them. In general, you don't have to get it down to species, but you need to have an idea of what your problem is and what you can do to help save your plants. Like I said, these diseases are very, very common here in Florida. Pretty much every plant that you are trying to grow outside is susceptible to something, usually a fungus, sometimes a bacteria, and sometimes a virus, but they're all going to get something at one point or another. Generally, they're much worse during times of year where it's warm, it's wet, we're getting frequent rains, it's humid weather, it's hot during the day, it's still warm at night. And what does that sound like? The weather here from spring all the way through fall, basically most of the year. During the winter, we kind of get a break from plant diseases, not 100%, but to a large extent we do. That's because the humidity will drop, temperatures are a little bit cooler, and that is not ideal for fungal disease growth. But for the rest of the year, and usually by the end of summer, if we've had a long, hot, wet, rainy summer, everybody has some kind of fungal disease on something growing in their yard. So it's really important that you learn some basics about what diseases are going to be the most common for what you're trying to grow. Let's say you're trying to grow peaches, there's certain diseases they're going to get, and you're going to have to use fungicides on them. Citrus is the same way. Vegetables are going to get a lot of fungal diseases. Some get very few, others get a lot, and it makes them really difficult to grow here without using fungicides. So we're going to go into that a little bit further in depth in part 2 of our diagnosing plant disease class coming up in just a few weeks. So poor planning, and this is what an awful lot of problems kind of stem from. Poor planning can lead to failed expectations. I think a lot of times people will move to Central Florida from another state and they try to grow what they grew there the same way they grew it there at the same time of year, and it doesn't work out very well. Very important that you need to know your USDA growing zone here, and Central Florida is going to be either 9A or 9B. Now, if anybody is watching us who lives up in North Florida or up in the Panhandle, you are in a different zone. So gardening up there is different from here in Central Florida. And also, if you live in South Florida, down in Miami, Homestead, is totally different down there also. Florida is a very, very long state, and we have a wide variety of different growing conditions. And there are things that will grow just great here in Central Florida that won't do well in South Florida or North Florida, and vice versa. You need to follow University of Florida recommendations for Central Florida if you live here in Central Florida, because our timing, like I said, is going to be a little bit different from, let's say, if you live in Jacksonville or if you live down in Miami. And the first thing that people learn, usually the hard way, is that our schedule here in Central Florida is very different from up north. So to give you a good example, all summer long, June, July, and August, every time I go to a gardening group on Facebook, I see people asking the question, what's wrong with my tomatoes? What's wrong with my cucumbers? They have spots on the leaves and all these insects eating them, and they have fungal diseases all over. My plants are totally dying. And people will recommend a lot of different things, 90% of which are not correct. Because for here in Central Florida, the correct answer is you do not grow tomatoes and cucumbers and squash successfully during June, July, and August. It's too hot here. And we're going to touch again on that in a minute about what we do grow in the summer here and what you grow in the winter here, and why it's important you do the correct thing at the correct time of year. But just remember that you need to find out the proper schedule for where you live, because our schedule is very, very different from up north. So looking at that all-important Florida-friendly landscape principle of putting the right plant in the right place, there are certain things that are just never going to do well here in Central Florida. So people will move here from up north and they want to plant apples and pears and cherries, and they do not do well here because we are too far south, and almost all the different varieties of those plants need more cold weather every winter than what we normally get here. And if they don't get that cold weather, they're not going to flower correctly in the spring, and they're not going to give you a good crop of fruit. So there are varieties of apples that are called low chill apples that will grow here in Central Florida. And a few people have good success with them, but they're very, very difficult. And probably 9 out of 10 people I know of that have tried growing them, either the trees promptly died within the first year or two, or they gave up. And at best, every couple of years, they get a handful of apples that were more like the size of crab apples. Pears do not do well in Florida because we have a disease here that kills pears very quickly. That's why if you go to the store to buy pears, pears are not grown commercially east of the Mississippi River because of that disease. Up north, you can have, it's possible to grow pears north of Florida, but even there, they have to use a lot of fungicides and disease controls. It's difficult. So the only place where you're going to grow fantastic pears is like Washington State and Oregon, but not Central Florida. Cherries just doesn't get cold enough here. A few other ones, raspberries, one of my favorite fruits, won't grow here. Won't get cold enough during the winter for long enough. Some people do have some success with them, but it's very, very difficult because of the climate. Other things can grow very well here in Central Florida: citrus, different varieties of peaches, plums, and nectarines, but you have to pick the right variety. If you just look through a catalog online and order a peach tree that looks beautiful and gives you wonderful, beautiful, tasty peaches, and that variety grows really well in Georgia or Ohio, it's probably not going to do well here, because it's, like I said, those varieties require a lot more cold weather than what we get here in Central Florida. There are varieties that do well here, but you have to do some homework and figure out what variety you want to grow first, and then go hunting and purchase the tree after that. For anybody who's curious, and I see this an awful lot, lavender does not grow well here in Florida. It will grow for a short time, but the heat, humidity, and diseases of summer will promptly take it out. So lavender, I think they grow commercially in Kansas and Idaho and states like that. And their weather is totally, totally different from what we have here. For vegetables, almost all vegetables will grow here if you grow them at the right time of year. Brussels sprouts need lots of cold weather during the winter. So if it's a fairly warm winter like we're having this year, Brussels sprouts are not going to do well. Next winter, we may have a long, cold winter and Brussels sprouts will grow just great. Same thing for a few other crops. Spinach is fussy. If it gets too warm, spinach won't do well. But if it's cold for a couple months during the winter, spinach can do well. So remember, right plant, right place. And remember that not all of Florida is the same. Like I said, what the advice I'm giving you is primarily for Central Florida. North Florida is going to be a little bit different, and South Florida a little bit different, kind of in the other direction. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, here in Central Florida, if you try growing tropical fruits like bananas, papayas, lychees, mangoes, and there's a whole bunch of other ones, they will be damaged by cold weather, which we normally get every winter. This winter's been a little bit unusual. It's been fairly warm, but winter's not over yet. We still could have a really bad cold front in 2 weeks with below freezing weather. And if you're trying to grow mangoes and lychees out in your backyard, they will be damaged. So they are definitely worth a try, but be advised that you need to have a plan in place to keep them warm if it gets really cold, if needed. You can't just plant tropical fruits in the middle of your backyard or front yard here and hope for the best, because during a lot of winters, the best probably isn't going to happen. So you need to be advised and have a plan in place. They are definitely worth a try, and a lot of people in Central Florida do have very good luck. I know people who have very good luck with lychees. I know somebody here in Spring Hill, they sent me a picture of a tree they didn't know what it was. It was a mango tree and covered with mangoes, so it can be done. But remember, they're going to need some cold protection during the winter. So along with right plant in the right place, you need to follow the right timing also, because really bad things will happen if you try planting vegetables and other edible crops at the wrong time of year. Because both lettuce and tomatoes grow very, very well here in Central Florida, just not at the same time. Lettuce grows well during the winter, anytime between October and maybe March, and tomatoes grow well in the early spring, and then once again in the fall. So you need to look online and follow University of Florida growing advice. You're more than welcome to contact our office for more information. But if you look online and just Google University of Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide, they have a very, very good, very thorough vegetable guide that tells you exactly when to plant things in North Florida, Central Florida, and South Florida. So just follow the column for what part of Florida you live in, and you can see when you should be starting these different crops, when you should be harvesting, and when they're going to grow the best. What surprises and confuses a lot of people initially is they're used to growing all their crops during the summer, because up north, that's when you do it. But here in Central Florida, from about the middle of June to the middle of August is generally closed season. There are really no traditional vegetable crops that are going to do well that time of year. Now, there are tropical vegetables that you could try growing, and they can do really well here during the summer. So they're a lot of fun to experiment with. Things like chayote squash, yard-long beans, some different various tropical vegetables. But the more traditional lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, tomatoes, peppers, things like that do not do well during the heat of summer here, because it's too hot, too rainy, too wet, too many insects, and too many diseases. So a lot of times people's crops will promptly fail. And a lot of times, no matter how much you spray them or what you spray them with, it's not going to change that, and you're not going to do well. So proper timing is very, very important here. So remember that learning a little bit goes a long way towards being successful, and we're here to help you. We have a lot of these tutorial type videos. We record basically all of our classes anymore, and we'll put them back on our Hernando County Extension Facebook page. Lilly will put them on her Facebook page. We put them on YouTube. Thursday morning, we have a weekly virtual plant clinic where you can go on Facebook Live or YouTube Live and ask your questions, and we'll do our very best to answer them live. So if you have questions or need a little bit more help, or you want to watch tutorials on, gosh, we have classes on growing sweet potatoes in Central Florida, strawberries, different types of tropical squashes, a wide variety of topics, which is a really, really good way to get started gardening here in Central Florida. So with that, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and ask us. You can call our office right here, or you can email me directly. A lot of times, the quickest and best way to get an answer is email me and send lots of pictures. There's no such thing as too many pictures. So good pictures go a long ways towards us being able to identify what your problem is. So Lily, I think that's about all I had today on that topic.
Okay, let's go over maybe a few questions that people might have about vegetable gardening.
Sure.
So we are filming this. This is January 11, 2022. Say I wanted to start growing some edible crops on this 3-day weekend coming up. So, you know, mid-January. Do you have any advice on what I should start? Should I start at seed? Should I start transplanting? And what vegetables?
We are right in the middle of 2 different seasons. So you still have enough time to plant some cool weather crops, things like radishes, grow very quickly. You could try lettuce. It takes a little bit longer to grow, but you should still be able to plant it and get it harvested before March, which is when it starts to warm up. But right now is the time of year where you want to start planting seeds for tomatoes, peppers, any kind of peppers, hot peppers, sweet peppers, and eggplants for this coming spring. You want to start those seeds in little pots or trays or flats right now. You have to keep them warm. If we get a freeze, you're going to have to bring them inside to keep them warm, but you're going to start those transplants in little pots right now. That way, when we get up till the end of February, beginning of March, and they're ready to go in the ground, you'll have nice, big, healthy transplants already. So we're kind of right in between. It's not spring yet, but winter is getting really, really close to ending.
Okay, and you mentioned the closed season during the summer because vegetable gardens are smarter than we are. They don't want to be hanging out there.
Yes.
But you mentioned some of the fun tropical fruits, but there are 3 what I would call Southern standards that you can grow during that hot time. And what are they?
There are a few things that you can grow. One of those is okra, because okra is technically a tropical vegetable. It comes from tropical parts of Africa. Black-eyed peas, and black-eyed peas are in the bean family, but it's technically a different species from traditional peas. So black-eyed peas are tropical, and they grow just fine during the heat of summer, believe it or not. And you can get a very, very good crop of black-eyed peas here. And sweet potatoes are tropical also. You want to plant sweet potatoes in the spring, and they grow all summer long, and they grow like crazy. They don't mind the heat and humidity, and they grow until fall, which is when you're going to dig them up and actually get the sweet potato roots to harvest.
Okay, so would you suggest planting in the ground, you know, right in the ground in our sandy soil, or would you steer people more towards raised beds or container gardening?
All the above can work very well. Containers work very well. I grow a lot of things in containers still, even though I have an in-ground garden. Containers are very easy to manage, and you can use quality potting soil and bag compost so that you don't have any kind of soil organisms. I mentioned nematodes at the very beginning. So if you're growing in containers in clean soil, you don't have a nematode problem. Raised beds work really, really well. You're going to bring in quality soil and compost, and that's what you're growing in. Gardening just straight in the ground works very well also. Very important that you either make your own or purchase plenty of compost to help build up the soil, because our native soil is, if you hadn't noticed, very, very sandy. and drains very well, which is good when we have a hurricane, not so good when you're trying to grow vegetables because it drains a little too quickly. And no organic matter means it's going to drain very fast, not a whole lot of nutrients. So you really want to build that soil up with compost. But all those different ways can work very well.
And you and I have compost classes very often, one or more times a month usually. And the solid waste division here in Hernando County offers free compost bins to our residents. So we talk about this a lot. What if you're on a mini farm or something and you have some chickens or rabbits or horses? What about the safety factor using animal manure for your vegetable garden compost, or even just throwing it right on for fertilizer? I know some people like to do that as well.
Some people do, and that's usually not a very good idea. You want to be very careful when using any kind of raw animal manure, and even if you've composted it for a while, it has to be composted correctly for it to be safe and dangerous pathogen free. Because if you're using that compost with edible crops, it could get onto your vegetables or in your vegetables. And I know that we've all heard in the past about food safety outbreaks, problems with salmonella and E. coli. And a lot of times they track it back to poor handling or poor management of raw animal manure. So there are ways to safely use animal manure in a vegetable garden, but you really want to contact our office or come by and speak with us. We can give you all the information and safeguards and things that you want, steps you want to take to keep you and your family safe. And don't ever just take raw animal manure and either mulch with it or throw it in the garden and start planting in it. A lot of times that can be potentially very, very dangerous.
Okay. And I have just a couple other questions. I was thinking about, I see a lot of people, especially it seems like in the heat of the summer to me, or at least through June, growing watermelons. What do you have to say about growing watermelons here?
Watermelon can grow very well here. They are grown commercially throughout Florida, all the way from Homestead, which is down in the southern tip of Florida, all the way up to the Panhandle. But even the commercial growers follow the correct timing. The watermelons grown down in South Florida are planted, gosh, they're probably up and growing right now. So they're planted very, very early. As we start in the spring and summer, the growers plant it further and further and further north. And you know that by 4th of July or August or September, you know, when you go to a picnic and you want to buy a watermelon, it's probably coming from the Carolinas at that point.
Okay.
So timing for your location is very, very important. If you plant them too late, you're going to have a really, really tough time with insect pests and diseases, especially diseases, because we have at least a dozen different nasty plant viruses that affect watermelons here in Florida now, and they keep finding new ones. So timing, very important.
What if I want to have blueberries in my yard? What should I do?
You can grow blueberries here in Central Florida. We have a number of different U-pick blueberry operations. And there are varieties. You have to plant the right variety for it to do well here because it's matched up with the amount of cold weather we get every winter to keep them happy. But blueberries have to grow in a very low pH acidic soil. So if you go to a big box store and buy a blueberry bush and just dig a hole in your yard and put it in, most likely your soil pH is going to be way too high and the blueberry is going to turn yellow and die very quickly. So commercial grow, something a homeowner can do is if you work in a lot of peat moss with the soil, peat moss is naturally very acidic, that will help lower the pH and increase your chances of success. For commercial blueberry farms, they really don't grow the blueberries in the soil. They make a raised bed out of finely ground pine trees and pine tree compost. And that's what they're growing the plants in because that's nice and acidic and the plants will grow really, really well.
And if I have some fruit trees, such as peaches, citrus, things like that, is now a good time to prune them? Or when should I get them on a pruning schedule?
Everyone is different. So every different fruit tree is pruned differently. For example, citrus trees really don't have to be pruned. You just have to remove any dead branches, maybe a very, very light trimming. For peaches, plums, and nectarines, very important that even after you plant a very young tree, you start shaping it. You want it to be shaped like a vase, like a big wine glass, where you have branches on the sides, but it's hollow in the center to get lots of sunlight. Other trees are all pruned differently. So like I mentioned earlier, if you just look online under University of Florida Peach Tree Care, there's a very good guide there with diagrams and pictures about how to prune your peaches. Another one with pruning citrus. So each different crop is going to get pruned a little bit differently, and you have to do each correctly for it to grow and produce the way you want it to.
Okay, one more question.
Okay.
Say I want to turn my yard into a food forest. And I want to do that because after the first year of getting it established, I want there to be no maintenance or little to no maintenance. Is that a realistic thought?
Well, that is a very good question because there's a huge amount of interest in food forests, edible landscaping, people turning their property and getting rid of the lawns and putting in things that they can eat. And that's all great. Most important step you're going to take is plan. A very detailed, drawn out plan, very well researched to make sure everything you're planning on growing is going to do well here and has a good chance of success. Shooting for no maintenance is probably not going to happen because all these crops need a certain amount of maintenance. Keep in mind, almost none of them are really native to Florida. All these different, citrus comes from China. Peaches, plums, and nectarines come from the Middle East. They all come from somewhere else. So they're all going to need a certain amount of maintenance, a certain amount of pruning. Knowing what you're doing and doing it correctly the first time is a really good way to save time and energy and potentially money also. So learning and doing your homework and finding out exactly how to maintain each one makes it a lot easier. But there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free fruit tree or a free harvest, really. It's going to take at least a little bit of effort on your behalf.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Lester. That was very interesting. And hopefully for our listeners, they'll at least, feel a little more educated, a little more prepared to start producing edible crops. And at least the biggest thing that they know is where to go if they think they have a problem. And like you
Exactly.
said, there's never enough pictures. Take enough pictures and email Dr. Lester at wlester@ufl.edu. And
Yes,
if he
ma'am.
doesn't know the answer, he knows a lot of really smart people at the University of Florida, and one of them will get your answer for you and probably will not cost you anything. If there is some disease testing, it might cost, a little bit of money. Yeah, but
Exactly, but that rarely happens. We're able to answer the vast majority of questions through emails and good pictures.
mhm. Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Lester, for joining us today. And we will see you again. Like he said, we're having more classes coming up on what could go wrong.